In an interview with Middle East expert Martin Fletcher on MSNBC's Live with Kate Snow, a long discredited graphic depicting Israel as stealing land from Palestine made it on air. Let's take a look at that clip.
We have a map that shows historically the areas that used to be Palestine in 1946, and then the UN plan there, and then as it shrunk down to basically Gaza and the West Bank, right? And then present.
This graphic has been seen as propaganda and has been linked to anti-Semitic conspiracy groups furthering misinformation surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's a great place to bring in our roundtable today. And joining us today, we have Larry Elder and David Goodfriend. Always good to have you both back. So
thank you. Thank you.
I want to start with you, Larry, if we can. Do you think that this was a deliberate error by the network, or a case of media bias, or do you think this was just something they let slip past them?
I really don't know. All I know is it seems to be a pattern on MSNBC. They've got this reporter who reported that a Palestinian terrorist did not have a knife in his hand, when in fact you could see that he had a knife in his hand. It certainly is irresponsible. That map is a UN map from 1947, and that is what Palestine would have been had Israel not been simultaneously invaded by 5 countries in 1948. And so it suggests that Israel has stolen land from the Palestinians. And so whether it was intended or not, it certainly created a very, very unfair impression about what's going on right now.
David, do you think they can recover from something like this?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the network did the right thing by issuing a correction. And frankly, it reminds me a lot of when Fox News had to issue a correction when one of its guests said that neighborhoods in Paris are limited exclusively to Muslims. That had to be retracted. The guest was wrong. It happens, and there is a bias. I do think that I want to agree with Larry on something. You know, the history of Israel is very complex. There was a partition plan that the UN had agreed to. Larry is right. Arab nations attacked Israel during the War of Independence in 1948. But I think that if we want to really understand what's going on today, the area of the West Bank that was supposed to really make up the bulk of a new Palestinian state under the Oslo Accords has been experiencing increased settlement construction there. That's a fact. And I think that we also can acknowledge that the Netanyahu government has explicitly said it doesn't intend to pursue a two-state solution. That's where this debate ought to be focused, not on, you know, one network's kind of ridiculous portrayal of history, but rather what's going on right now. Because I think it's tragic what's going on in Israel.
You know, that's the thing to me that is the most tragic thing about all this. I mean, how many people know that they're, you know, at the inside NBC, with the exception of Martin Fletcher, who said, yeah, I knew the map was inaccurate, I just didn't feel like I could speak up during the middle of the segment. But there is no Palestinian state right now. That's why they talk about a two-state solution. Right. But, you know, to millions of Americans who watch MSNBC, they probably think, well, there is a nation of Palestine right now.
Well, what David Goodfriend just now said, though, was misleading. In 1967, there weren't any settlements, yet Israel was still attacked. And to suggest that Bibi Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution is unfair. In the waning days of the campaign for re-election, he said he doubted that a two-state solution was viable, was possible, because the other side does not want peace. That's what he meant. Israel would love to have two states, provided the other side would renounce violence, which they have not done.
I wish I could agree with that, but there simply is a one-state school of thought within Israel that would like to annex the West Bank. And to me, it's very dangerous. If you want to have a democratic Jewish state, the population of Palestinians is simply growing faster. You will have, in effect, an apartheid state if you have a one-state solution. And I don't think that's healthy for the longevity of an independent Jewish state that's a democracy. I'd much rather see 2 separate countries. Let's have a divorce. You know, these people don't like each other. They're not supposed to love each other. They're not supposed
guys,
to
let's talk about
kumbaya.
something that John Kerry said a little bit earlier today. Secretary of State John Kerry, well, he said it yesterday, but today he called on Israeli and Palestinian leaders to take action against the current senseless violence. That's his choice of words. He also said this.
We continue to urge everybody to exercise restraint and to restrain from any kind of self-help in terms of the violence.
John Kerry doesn't seem to usually help out in these situations, does he, Larry?
No, he doesn't. He's acting like there's a moral equivalence. And the polls show that 60% of those living in the West Bank and in Gaza want a Palestinian state. They call it historic Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with no Israel in the middle. That's the problem. They don't want two states. They want one state called Palestine, which absorbs Israel. There's no Jewish state. That's why there's not peace here.
Well, it seems like there's never going to be peace. I mean, it seems like we could air a story from 5 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like we could air a story from like 5 years ago, and people wouldn't know if that happened yesterday or 5 years ago.
That's absolutely right. I agree with that, and I actually think, you know, there's this old saying that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result.
Right.
And what I think is required here, and I actually heard a speaker. You've heard of the Zogby polls. You know, Mr. Zogby is himself Arab Palestinian.
Yeah.
You're right. So I heard him say something that actually I think is right for both sides, and that is, if you don't like the status quo, you've got to make a major shift. You've got to change
And I think
something.
a lot of people agree with you. We're going to have to leave it right there, but there's still much more to come with today's roundtable. Up next for discussion, as gun control takes center stage from the left, some question whether Hillary Clinton is contradicting herself, while others think the movement is just plain too white, where advocates may look to round up support for their cause. And conservatives may not support him, but apparently a lot of Americans do, where President Obama's ratings stand right now, and whether or not that could help the Democrats.
The Australian government, as part of trying to clamp down on the availability of automatic weapons, offered a good price for buying hundreds of thousands of guns. So I think that's worth considering. I don't know enough details to tell you how we would do it or how it would work, but certainly the Australian example is worth looking at.
That was Hillary Clinton discussing the possibility of a gun buyback program at a New Hampshire town hall, offering Australia as a good example of clamping down on guns. Well, Australia's program was a mandatory program after the law banned semi-automatic and automatic rifles and shotguns. So let's bring in our roundtable once again. Rejoining us, author and radio host Larry Elder. Also with us again, former Deputy Staff Secretary for President Bill Clinton, attorney David Goodfriend. Thanks for sticking around, guys.
Thank you.
All right, in response to this, Chris Cox, the NRA's top lobbyist, reacted to Hillary's comments that we just heard there. This is what Cox said in a statement. Hillary Clinton's extreme views are completely out of touch with the American people. The real goal of gun control supporters is gun confiscation. Now, David, we know how strong the Clinton campaign is. They obviously think this is something that's working on the campaign trail. We heard Hillary Clinton also talking about making parts of the Brady bill stronger again. This is going to work for her, I guess, on the Democratic campaign trail. Do you think it would work for her in a general election?
Well, I certainly think that it is a way for her to differentiate herself from Bernie Sanders with the left wing of the Democratic Party. I think you saw that in some of the exchanges they had during the Democratic debate, that Senator Sanders said, look, I come from a rural state, and she jumped on that. And I think that in the Democratic primary, her views probably reflect the majority of the Democratic Party. In a general election, it does change the calculus in certain states. Now, I've said this on your show before, and I just want to reiterate, the presidential election often comes down to about 1 million votes in a half dozen states or less. And the question is whether a gun debate in a state like, say, Ohio or Florida or Colorado would have a negative impact on the Democrats. Certainly there are strong gun rights advocacy constituencies in all three of the states I mentioned. But in a general election scenario, would the roughly 20% of the population that does not want any gun regulation change their vote in a way that would hurt Hillary Clinton? I would argue that those votes are already solidly Republican, and or at least the majority of them are, and that even the positions she's taking, if they're incredibly offensive to that 20%, I don't believe would really change the calculus for her trying to win in a general election scenario in those swing states.
Well, I highly doubt we'll hear anything about this in the general election campaign. I like to consider myself 1 in a million, David, because I am one of those independent voters from the state of Florida. Larry, what's your take?
You are 1 in a million.
My mom would say so anyway. But what's your take on this, Larry? I do not think we'll hear a peep from Hillary Clinton about this during the general election campaign, should she get the nomination.
I disagree with David very strongly. It is going to hurt her. Hillary said, I don't know all the details about Australia. As Miranda pointed out, it was mandatory. And one of Hillary's strong points is with black voters. I just saw a poll that if you add up the number of black voters who want the current gun laws to remain the same, or those who want fewer of them, it's 72%. And all she does is put kerosene on the fire of those of gun rights people who believe that the ultimate objective of those who want gun control is confiscation. She just now said that.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, Larry, too, because I wanted to get into this, too. Politico's reporting today that Black Lives Matter activists are now, quote, forging an alliance with gun control groups. Mark Morial, head of the National Urban League, says the current gun control movement is, in his words, too white, suggesting the current movement tends to neglect the kinds of gun violence that ravages minority and urban neighborhoods. The hope is that the alliance with Black Lives Matter activists will generate enough attention to pass stricter gun control laws. But you don't think this is going to work?
If Black Lives Matter, how about black opinions on guns? One more time, you add up the number of blacks who want fewer gun laws, plus those who feel that the current gun laws are the same. You got 72%, a much higher number than with whites. It's blacks who are being disproportionately hurt by urban violence. They want self-protection. They don't want their guns taken away.
Go ahead, David.
Here's a question I would love to see posed to the NRA. I've heard the NRA say in congressional testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee that the intent of the Second Amendment is to, in effect, keep the state, the police, in check, and that having arms means being able to fight back against even the police. Now, I wonder if that calculus would change if people in urban America said, well, what about Ferguson or Baltimore? What if those people had said, hey, NRA, help us. We want guns to arm ourselves against the police. I think that would put the NRA in a very tight pickle because a lot of their members want people to have guns to defend themselves against what they think are criminals.
The Oath Keepers, gun rights advocates.
More whites are shot by the cops than blacks are shot by cops. Blacks aren't being
Larry.
killed by
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there.
It's a topic for another time, though.
Gentlemen, we'll see you next week. The roundtable always